In his entire 18 years of living, Brandon had faced more pain than most old folks faced throughout their lives. When he was little, he broke his arm on the playing ground. And no, he had not been playing or doing any dangerous exercises. Nobody ever wanted to play with the weird kid with red hair, so he sat on the bench at the far end of the school's playing ground and tried to fix a Harry Potter puzzle. His classmates were playing with the ball, and one of them had come up with a genius idea to throw the ball at the kid who sat alone at playtime and concentrated on his puzzles. And the others agreed that it was an idea as brilliant as one of Einstein's theories. And that was how the ball was chucked in his direction. With the aid of his peripheral vision, he had seen the ball come at him, and of course, he tried to duck. But as he ducked, his elbow got stuck in the arm of the bench, and when he pulled it, he broke his arm, and the ball still whacked him on the head. And that is the story of how Brandon Jenkins left school wailing with a broken arm and a banging head. When he returned to school 2 weeks later with his hand in a cast, his classmates who had thrown the ball at him were cautioned and let go without any real punishment, and people snickered behind his back, and he was nicknamed the Cast Boy. All through his middle school years, he was bullied, and he could not figure out why. It could not be because he was dumb. No, he was smart, the smartest in his class. Or was it because of his fiery red hair? Or maybe it was because he had the smallest stature amongst all his classmates. Or maybe it was just his fate. But he bore everything with a thick skin. When he informed his teacher about the bullying, the woman only warned the boys who had innocent looks on all their faces. She must not have known the extent of the bullying, else she would not have treated the matter lightly. But Brandon did not talk, and he did not even find the strength in him to continue to inform the woman about the bullying. So when he was in his freshman year of high school, and his mom decided that they should move from their town to a different one, he was extremely happy. Not just because of the bullying, but because his father had recently been involved in a hit and run, and he had been the driver. He was on his way back from the bar where he hung out with his buddies, Steve and Jim, and he was tipsy. He could have hitched a ride with Steve, whose house was not far off from their own, or he could have even called a cab, or he could have walked home, or he could have done any of the other 50 things that he was supposed to. Instead, as tipsy as he was with his shaky hands and blurred vision, he got behind the steering wheel and drove off from the bar. He had barely gone 2 miles when he drove straight into a car that had a couple and their 2 kids in it. It was a gory sight. The parents and one of the kids died on the spot, and the other one was in a coma. But his dad? Nothing, except banging his head on the airbag happened to him. Then he wrenched all over the car, and as soon as he could, as fast as he could, he walked away from the scene. He did not go home. He stumbled around town with his shaky hands and teary eyes. He knew the extent of what he had done, and he was scared. His car was still at the scene. His driver's license was in it. His fingerprints were everywhere there, and his family photo was in there. He knew that there was no way he could run. He knew that it wouldn't take the cops 3 minutes to know that he was the one who bashed into the lovely couple's car. He knew that it wouldn't take them 5 minutes to smell the alcohol in his vomit. He knew he was done for. He was not even rich enough to hire a good lawyer, and even if he could, the pieces of evidence were all there. And the court wasn't stupid. Even if the court was stupid, he had enough conscience to know that if he wasn't punished, he would have no rest. He wanted to be punished to atone for the sin of destroying that innocent family. But he was scared of being punished. If he went to prison, then what would happen to his own family? How would it affect his son? His wife? How long would he stay in prison? How old will his son be when he came back out? Will his wife still be willing to remain with him after he came out? Will people call him a murderer? He sat by the roadside, put his face in his hands, and began to cry. His shoulders shook as he cried because he cried hard. He cried for himself and his family, and for the people he harmed. He sat there for a long time before he got up and walked home. As expected, his wife was antsy when he got there. covered with dirt and vomit, also did not help his condition. As she yelled at him, "What have you done, Larry? Why did the cops come here?" He could not say anything. He was too teary to speak, but he wanted to apologize to them. He wanted to hold them for one last time, because he knew that after he left that house again, to even breathe the same air as them would be a privilege. But they wouldn't hold him. His wife was scared. Her eyes darted from him to their son to the door. Brandon wanted to go to him, but his mother held him back. And at that moment, Larry knew that all he could do was to go hand himself over to the cops. And he walked out with his chest hurting. His family had turned away from him, and he could not even bring himself to begin to blame them. There was nothing scarier than the cops showing up at your house asking for your husband, who they strongly believe was a hit-and-run driver. The cops were more than happy to put him in cuffs and hold him behind bars. He was offered an attorney by the state, but he did not even care for the tiny woman who kept trying to get him to talk. He already knew his strategy. He would plead guilty in the law court and save himself the stress and trouble of the trial. There was no way he would attempt to fight for his freedom after he had stupidly sent a little kid to his early grave, and another one in a coma. Even if the one in a coma survived, he would be alone, without his family. Brandon was in his freshman year of high school, yet he felt sick leaving him out there while he went off to serve the punishment of his crime. What about the little kid? How could he feel when he woke up, if he woke up, to find out that he had to navigate this big scary world all on his own? He would probably be passed down from one foster home to another, and he would probably act out. He would probably put up an always angry facade to fend off the rest of the world and cope with the pain. Larry would never forgive himself if he walked around freely while a boy went through all of that pain. So he barely registered anything the tiny lawyer lady said to him, and he stared out into space. Of course, when he pled guilty, the court ruled for him to be put behind bars. He was sentenced to 10 years and charged with negligent manslaughter. As he thought, his family was affected. At the local store where his wife worked, customers gave her wary eyes because they knew that her husband was in jail. The town was a small one, and everyone knew everyone's family history. So it was not strange when people gave her weird stares, almost as though they were expecting her to run into the nearest car and run over them with it. Her husband made a mistake. Why was that so hard for people to deal with? She did not ask for them to get over it. She had not even gotten over it herself. But it sure would have helped if she wasn't always looked at with guarded eyes. She was tired of it, and it irked her to her very core. When she yelled at a woman one Friday night, she knew that it was time to quit her job. People would forever refer to her as the woman whose drunk husband ran into a family, and she could not continue to work in the store when all she wanted to do was whack the people on their heads with their packaged goods. When she quit, her boss was relieved to see her go. The man liked her and did not want her to leave, but he was not blind. He too had noticed the weird stares people gave to her. She dropped her quit letter and walked out of the store without saying goodbye to any of her coworkers, because they did not reach out to her when her husband was sentenced. Instead, like the customers, they regarded her with wary eyes and stole glances at her when they thought she was not looking. She could not be any more pissed. It was as though because her husband was involved in a hit and run, the whole family was made up of criminals. It was as though she was supposed to be behind bars as well. She did not necessarily even want their sympathy. All she wanted was a little bit of indifference. All she wanted was to walk into the gas station, refuel her car, and walk out without being looked at as if she was filling up her tank to knock some kids over. It was frustrating, and she could not even begin to imagine how it affected her son, Brandon. Brandon had always been bullied, and it sure as hell did not help when his dad was sentenced to jail for a crime. They threw paper airplanes with a caricature of a man behind bars at him. They made up bad puns and made fun of him with it. They tripped him in the hallway, and when he fell, they said it was karma punishment for his dad's sins. They made continuous fun of him, and he continued to bear it until the day a kid outrightly called him the son of a drunk murderer. Brandon punched him right in his face, and the boy stumbled backward. Before he could regain his footing, Brandon placed another punch on his face again. The boy stumbled and struggled to hold something. He finally did, but it was the sharp side of a locker, and it sliced his hand. The boy groaned out in pain, and just as Brandon was about to send another punch to his face, their physics teacher showed up and took them to the principal's office. The other kid was bleeding so much from his hand, and a purple mark was beginning to form on his right cheek where Brandon had punched him. So he was sent to the school's infirmary, and Brandon had to sit in the principal's office while she scolded him. She was not too pleased with his display in the hallway, and she reprimanded him for it. The thing was, because everyone knew that his dad had recently been sentenced to jail, the principal thought he was only acting out. What she failed to understand was that the other kids had pushed him until he had no other choice but to fight back. If he wanted to act out, he would have stayed away from the school after the incident, or he would have punctured all the teachers' cars' tires. But the boy knew that acting out was difficult and would stress him a lot. He had accepted that his dad messed up, and he accepted the punishment that his family had to face. He was taking everything like he usually took it, with a thick skin. But the school authorities deemed it fit to punish him and the other kids with a week-long suspension, and he returned home with a deep frown and a suspension letter. When he divulged everything to his mom, she was pissed. Of course, she knew that her son would be on the receiving end of the mean words and stares, but she did not expect the kids to go that brutal on him. And now his school document would hold records of suspension, all because of an insensitive, bratty kid. She was pissed that the school authorities did not do anything to stop the kids, until Brandon had to take matters into his hands and send that one kid to the school's sick bay. But what pissed her off the most was that the actions that Brandon had taken were going to solidify the opinion that people already had of their family. They would turn up their noses at him and say that he was just like his father and that bad blood ran in the family. She knew that, and she wasn't going to stand by and watch her kid go through all that. And she knew that it was time for them to leave town. She drove Brandon a few towns away to the jail his dad was being held. She had still not forgiven him for drunk driving, and she blamed him for all that she and their son were going through. So she did not want to see him. But he knew that she owed it to Brandon to see his dad again before she whisked him across the country and to a different town from the one he grew up in. Brandon was happy at the fact that he got to see his dad again, and was particularly happy that he would leave that godforsaken town for a different one. Who wouldn't like a fresh start after being stuck in an unfavorable environment for all their life? They began the drive to the jail early that morning so that they would reach early and would get back to their home before dusk. His mother hated driving in the dark, and it did not help that the car accident his dad was involved in happened in the dark. When they got to the prison, they were asked to wait alongside a few other people. They waited roughly 20 minutes before they were called forward by a female officer, in a cubicle that was separated from the waiting area by iron bars. It was ironic to Brandon that the woman was watching over prisoners who were behind bars. It was ironic to Brandon that the woman who was watching over prisoners who were behind bars, and at that moment, she too was placed behind one. But he quelled the amusement that he got from that and walked up to the cubicle with his mom. The woman read out several instructions to them, then his mom said that she was not there to see anyone. So they led Brandon through an adjoining door to a corridor, and from the corridor to another waiting room. But this waiting room looked like the one he saw in movies, with chairs that faced each other and were demarcated from each other by huge tables, and several guards stood around. Brandon was led to a table, and he sat down on a seat as he waited for his dad to come out. He looked around. The walls of the prison were painted brown, and although the place was old, it was well kept and nothing was out of place. 3 tables away from him, a woman sat in a blue prison uniform, and an elderly man who he guessed to be her father sat opposite her. A guard hung close to them. The old man's hands were in a fist, and the younger lady was openly weeping as she talked to him. Brandon felt sorry for them. He wondered if the woman was innocent, and he imagined what the man could be going through, seeing as he was faced with the same thing. Just then, a loud beep rang from the door, and the sound of bars being pulled apart was heard in the room. Reflexively, he turned to look, and he saw his dad walk out of the door with his handcuffed hands. Brandon's heart sank deeper than a stone in a river. It was his first time seeing his dad in cuffs, and it made it all the more real that his father was in jail. His dad walked toward him when he sighted him, and Brandon took the opportunity to observe his dad. He was in an orange jumpsuit, and the boy was immediately reminded of the movie he had binge-watched the last summer, Orange is the New Black. But he had not felt the tight feeling in his chest when he saw Poppy in handcuffs. He did not feel like crying when they did their shenanigans, or when they were served little portions of food in the cafeteria. His dad looked frail. His hands looked small, and his eyes were sad, even though he tried to conceal it by smiling when he saw Brandon. But the boy had lived with him all his life, and he knew that the man was simply faking the sunny facade so that he would leave the place thinking that his old man was okay. When his father finally sat, he said, "Brandon, my boy. Oh, I'm so glad to see you." Brandon was happy to see him, too. The man was still his father. Yes, he made a brutal mistake and hurt some people. Yes, he endangered his own life. Yes, he put him in the spotlight for bullies, but it was the same man who took him fishing when he was 8. The same man who watched all of Marvel's movies with him when his arm broke and he was away from school for a week. His dad had taught him how to repair the kitchen tap that always went bad. His dad doted on his mom. He bought dresses that he thought would suit her, and he never hesitated to compliment her. But the courts did not care that he was a loving husband and a caring father, especially after he had pled guilty at the beginning of the trial. It was sad that such a good man had gone to jail for such a terrible mistake. It was sad that nobody cared about any of the nice things he had done. How many old folks he had helped carry their bags from a shop to their car, the number of dresses he had bought for his wife, or when he stayed up at night to tend to his son who had a broken arm. All that mattered, at that moment, was that he had bashed into a family's vehicle. That was all that defined him. Was it not funny how one bad immediately canceled the 99 good that he had done? Was it not funny that people were quick to cancel him out for the one bad thing he had done and overlook the number of times he was a nice fellow? "I'm happy to be here too, Dad," Brandon said truthfully. His father asked about how he had been faring, and he said that all was well and good. He did not say that he had been suspended because then his dad would ask why, and when he explained the whole thing to him, it was surely going to make him sad. But as Brandon knew his dad well, that was exactly how his dad knew him, and his dad knew that he was hiding something. He said to his son, "What is the matter, son?" Brandon forced out a laugh. "No, Dad, nothing." His father reached his cuffed hands out to Brandon, but the guard warned him, so he tucked his hands down on his lap. It pained Brandon to see his dad in that manner. His father had always been free and happy and full of life, and now he was being told what or what not to do with his hands. It was a simple order that the guard had given. It was something that Brandon knew usually happened in jails. He had seen it in the numerous movies he watched. He saw it when he walked in and saw the weeping woman and the elderly man, but he did not know how it could hurt until it happened to him. Never did he imagine being restrained from holding his father. He did not tell his father that he had been suspended or that he got into a fight or that the other kids were bullying him in school. Instead, he said that his mom wanted them to move out of the town to another one. Either his father had learned how to school his expression from his short term in jail, or he expected something of the sort to come out of his son's mouth, because his expression did not seem the least bit shocked, and he nodded solemnly at Brandon. Brandon wanted him to speak, wanted to know how he felt about it, but his dad swallowed his reaction for a second or two. Then he turned to Brandon and gave out the widest grin the boy had ever seen in his entire life, and said to him, "Well, I'm sure you would do great wherever you go." The boy nodded at his father, and then, as though it was an afterthought, the man asked the boy, "How is your mother doing?" But Brandon knew that the thought of his mother's well-being had been bothering his dad throughout their entire conversation, and he answered that she was doing well, and he was happy at the smile that illuminated his dad's scruffy jaw. Then the guard that stood next to them walked to the table they sat on and banged his hand on it. He said in a hoarse voice, "Time's up." Larry ignored him and told his son, "You are capable of doing anything. Always remember that." The boy nodded through teary eyes as he watched his dad being dragged away from the table and back away from him. As he was being led back to the door, he turned to look at his son and said, "Take care of your mother, please." Brandon never felt more torn in his entire life. He was led back through the corridor and into the waiting room where his mother was. She looked relieved to see him come out of the door, and she hugged him in her tiny frame. They went back out through the door and silently entered the car. Their hearts were heavier than when they arrived at the jail, and Brandon was pissed at his mother. Why could she not get over the fact that his father had driven while drunk? He was not the first person to do it, and definitely will not be the last. He was just unlucky. Hundreds of people drove under the influence every other day, and some make it back to their homes in one piece. Others get pinched by the cops, but all they have to do is serve a little punishment meted out to them by the court. It was bad luck that caused his dad to run into that family, and he was serving a jail term for his mistake already. Why could she not see past it? When they safely got home, he walked out of the car, banged the door behind him, and walked up to his bedroom without bothering to eat dinner. He was not even hungry. Seeing your dad in cuffs would do that to you. His mother knew that he was mad, but what she did not know was that the anger was directed at her. So she took dinner up to his room, and when he answered her questions in monosyllables, she dropped the food on his nightstand, asked him to take a shower before bed, and walked out of his bedroom to give him space. Brandon took a shower and took the plate of food back to the kitchen late at night when he thought his mother was asleep. Instead, he found her in the kitchen, perched on a high stool, and her shoulders shook silently as she stared out through the window. He knew that she was crying, and he went to her and hugged her from the back. Her body immediately went stiff when she felt him, but he did not leave her. Instead, he walked around her and faced her. Her face was stained with tears, and a picture of her and his dad was in her shaky hands. He gave himself a mental kick. Why would he ever think that she did not care about his dad the way he did? She began to whimper. "I'm sorry, Brandon. I'm so sorry everything that you have faced at the hands of your class. I'm so sorry for everything you faced at the hands of your classmates." He mustered all the strength he had in him and nodded at her. She reached for his hands with her shaky ones and repeated, "I'm so sorry." He nodded at her again. Then he asked her the question that had been bothering him all day. "Mom, why didn't you go in and see Dad today?" She expected the question, but it still took her some time to answer. She retrieved her hands from his and turned her face to the side. He waited patiently for her response, and when she offered one, it was not one that he liked. She told him, "Brandon, I'm angry at your dad, like full-on livid. He did what he did without considering both our well-being. He hurt me, and I need time to get over it. That's why I did not go in to see him." As smart as Brandon was for his age, there was still some things that he was yet to understand about life, and one of them was that paying atonement for one's sins did not necessarily mean that the other person that was hurt would automatically forgive. Brandon's mom expected better from his dad. She would never have believed that he would put their family in such a tight spot, and every day, as people regarded her with wary eyes, it added a layer of anger to the one that she had brewed for her husband. But Brandon did not get this, and he immediately yelled at her. "Dad is sorry. He is sad and he regrets doing what he did. Why can't you accept that it is a mistake and move on already?" His mother chuckled dryly at him. "I'm not doing this with you, Brand. Go to bed." He frowned at her. "I'm not a kid, Mom. I'm capable of having this conversation with you. Dad misses you and you miss him. We're about to move to another state. Can't you just go see him before we leave?" She stood silently for a moment. She knew that she would love to see her husband, But she also knew that seeing him while she was in such a state would do more harm than good to the both of them. She slowly shook her head at Brandon. In anger and frustration, Brandon marched back up the stairs and shut his room door loudly behind him. The sound reverberated in his mother's ears downstairs, and she shook as she began to cry again. The family had never been so torn, and it only took one mistake to do that to them. Brandon settled for a passive-aggressive relationship with his mom. The only thing that kept him busy was actively packing everything he owned to leave town. For once in his life, he was happy that he had no friends. At least it was not difficult for him to pack up his stuff and leave the town he grew up in but never liked. His mother went to his school to request a transfer letter from his principal, and she refused to over one to them. She said that the notice was too late, and that the boy was on suspension, so it would be wrong for her to hand over a transfer letter to his mother. His mom had walked back out of the principal's office with a roll of her eyes and a heavy bang on the door. Brandon did not expect that his mom would return with the transfer letter, so he was not shocked when she returned to say that she was denied the note. She tried to make up with him by making his favorite meal, leaving notes outside his door every day, and trying to watch his favorite shows with him. But the boy ignored her, and it was not like he was happy to ignore her. He missed her, and her short temper and weird jokes, but he thought maybe if he just held on for a little while, she would give in and go to see his dad before they left. What he forgot was that his mother was a stubborn woman who only did what felt right to her. So she held on out and waited for him to get back to his normal relationship with her. They moved to Arizona the next week. They were a sight to behold, with their boxes and his mother's green sedan. The drive was long, and he could not continue being mad with his mom throughout the journey, so they made up on the drive there. The boy said that he was sorry for coming down at her in that manner, and that he would respect her decision to stay away, even though he did not support it. His mother did not say it, but she was extremely thankful to be blessed with such an understanding son. They made jokes as they drifted down the road. He complained about her slow driving and offered to drive. She slapped his hands from the steering wheel and asked him to keep his underage hands to himself. He argued that he was already 19, and she told him to get back to her when he was 21. The whole drive was full of fun, playful banter and laughter. It was exactly what they needed to repair their relationship. The drive from Indiana to Arizona was supposed to be 25 hours, as the internet had informed him. However, because of how slow his mom's driving speed was, they were still a few miles away from their destination when it was dark out. His mom, forever scared of night drives, said that they should pass the night in a cheap motel by the roadside. The motel was dingy and the floor smelt wet. They paid for a night, and when the receptionist asked them to enjoy their night, she said it with a trace of disgust from seeing an elderly woman and a younger boy check into a motel room. His mom was pissed about it, and just as she was about to turn around and ask the lady to mind her business, Brandon held her by her shoulder and turned her back in the direction of the stairs. She complained as she climbed the creaky stairs. What the hell was wrong with the woman? Why did hotel attendants never like to mind their own business? Why did they always seem to think the worst of people? Could she not tell that he was her son? Could she not tell that he was her son? The resemblance was uncanny. Behind her, Brandon just shook his head in amusement and took his turn to carefully climb the stairs. The receptionist was wrong, but he knew that the reason why his mother was so worked over it was because she was tired from the drive. And when she got tired, she got cranky. They did not even look alike. He had fiery red hair and she had soft brown curls that reached just below her shoulders. His eyes were larger than hers, and they were dark brown. Hers were blue and had a sparkling tint of brown in them. Their room was a single room, and it was even worse than downstairs. She had to turn the key wildly and kick the door before it opened for both of them to step in. There was no light in the room, and they had to use the light from their phones to navigate the place. They made out a tiny bed in the middle, and the sheets were thankfully dry. The ceiling looked as if it would close in on them at any time during the night, and it was safe to say that Brandon did not sleep. How could he? His mom, on the other hand, fell soundly asleep and did not bat an eyelid until the next morning when he shook her awake. They went downstairs, and his mom gave the receptionist an evil eye when she handed over their room key. They got into their vehicle, and in no time, they were in Arizona. A week later, she went around to the neighboring schools to see if any of them would accept her son in their school. It was the middle of the school year, and she could not produce a transfer transcript. Of course, they said no. So, Brandon had to abandon that school year and work as a barista in a coffee shop down the street until the next year. He was a smart kid, and he studied at night so that he would remain conversant with his books, and he also watched movies with his mom sometimes. He was okay with the way his life was, and then he made a friend, Michaela. The girl was tall, and she wore glasses. She also liked to talk, and she laughed loudly. Her dad was the owner of the coffee shop, and every day after school, she went over there. Even when it was a rush hour and they had a lot of waiting customers, she never offered to help. She would just sit at the corner in her favorite booth and laugh loudly at the books she liked to read. Brandon was intrigued by her, but he did not say anything to her. He had learned the hard way from associating with people that did not want to be associated with, so he let her be. And every afternoon, when she sat in her booth, slurped her beverage, and laughed loudly at her books, he watched her from the corner of his eyes. Michaela was the first to strike up a conversation with him. She had noticed the cute red-headed barista, and she walked up to him one evening when it was almost closing time and said, "Can you make me a latte?" She was fond of doing that, requesting stuff when it was almost closing time. The previous day, she had requested a sandwich from Warren, the guy who worked in the kitchen, and he frowned so hard as he made the food that it amused Brandon. But the thing was, Michaela did not ask unkindly. She always said please when she asked for anything, and she did not raise her voice at anyone. The other employees did not get her. They said she was spoiled rotten by her father, and she irked them so much. Brandon studied her. Yes, she was a little spoiled, but he did not see anything wrong with her. She was polite, she liked to read, and she smiled nicely when she asked for anything, just like she smiled as she asked for a cup of latte around 10 minutes to 9 o'clock. Brandon promised that he would get it to her in no time, and she sat on a stool next to the counter as she watched him prepare the beverage for her. When Brandon passed it to her, she received it with both hands, took a sip, and looked up at him with her large doe eyes. She said, "Where did you come from?" Brandon chuckled lightly at the question. He thought she liked the beverage in her hand and was complimenting it, so he answered, "Thank you. I worked hard to perfect my latte skills." She shook her head at him. "I'm not referring to the latte. I mean, where did you come from? It's obvious that you are new here." He cleaned the table with the white rag in his hand and asked, "And how would you know that I'm not from here?" She rolled her eyes at him as she sipped from the cup in her hand and said, "I would notice your red hair if you were from around here." "Oh, okay." Brandon raised his head from the counter to look at her, and she looked at him expectantly as she waited for the answers to her question. He said, "I recently moved here from Indiana." Her eyes formed two large full moons as she said, "Indiana? Oh, I've always wanted to go there. You know they acted Stranger Things over there, right? Please tell me you lived in Hawkins." Her enthusiasm was surprising. He had lived in Indiana all his life and had not seen anything particularly interesting about the place, and here this girl was vibrating with so much energy while she waited for him to tell her they lived in Hawkins. Just then, her dad, Mr. Morgan, walked out of his cubicle and into the room where they stood. He tapped his empty wrist to indicate that it was time for them to close up. The cafe was empty, safe for both of them, and Warren in the back. The waitress, Anna, had gone home immediately after the last customer walked out. The girl jumped off the seat and walked out with her dad. Brandon called out to Warren, and they closed up and went their separate ways. Just as the boy was about to start walking back to his house, he heard his name in the distance. It was Michaela. He was surprised because he thought she had left with her dad. She was a bit far from him, so she began to jog towards him. He did not understand her, and he waited for her to reach him and say what it was that she wanted to say. When she reached, she was out of breath, and it wouldn't have taken a professional to know that she hardly exercised. She breathed heavily as she said, "You did not answer my questions." "What question was that?" She looked surprised that he would forget that she asked him if he grew up in Hawkins, and he was surprised at the fact that her dad let her walk with him at the time of night. But knowing her, She had probably rushed off before her dad could even voice his concerns. When he said that he did not live in Hawkins, her mood deflated for a bit, but it picked back up as she soon found another topic to talk about. Brandon could barely get a word out as she talked about her friends, her last summer, the last book she read, and her favorite TV series. It was entertaining to watch her talk to him as if she had known him for years as they walked down the street. They were almost at his house when he realized that she had walked home with him. He turned to face her and managed to squeeze out a question as she was speaking about her pet dog, Blue. He asked, "Where do you live?" She ignored the question and dropped out one of hers. "Oh, are we there yet?" Brandon was stunned. "There where?" he asked her. "There where?" She looked at him like he was insane and said, "Your house, of course. I wanted to see where you live." Then Brandon knew that the girl had little to no boundaries, and he knew that he had to set some with her. He said, "I'm sorry, Michaela, but we are strangers, and it is already late. You can't follow me home." His speech must have popped some sense into her head, because her eyes widened, and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I just get easily used to people. I can go home now if you would book an Uber for me. My phone battery is dead." For the millionth time since Brandon started talking to her, he was amused. The girl's head was filled up with topics to discuss, and she did not bother about anything else. She acted immature, and her phone was dead when she was with a stranger at that time of night. He booked a ride for her, and while they waited for the driver to show up, she continued to talk. She said she liked math, but she hated physics, and her parents could never seem to understand it. She said for last Halloween she dressed up as herself. Finally, the Uber arrived and she got into it. She waved Brandon goodnight from the window, and the car drove up the empty street. When she showed up after school the next day, she did not sit in her usual booth. Instead, she climbed on the counter she had occupied the previous night while he made the cup of latte for her, and continued to overshare. It was strange. Brandon had always thought that oversharers were weird, and that he could not like people who talked a lot, but he undoubtedly liked Michaela. She was like a breath of fresh air. The fresh air that came with a lot of hand gestures, stories from her school, stories about her life, and it made him smile. She made him laugh and brought a big wave of teenage gossip into his life. He liked it. And that was how the rest of the school year went. She would come back from school, perch on the stool, and he talked when he was given the chance to. Their friendship was the perfect one. They complimented each other. He calmed her down when she got too energetic, and she helped him call over the waiter when they forgot to add fries to his order. Even his mother, who barely liked anyone, liked her. It was fun to hang out with her in her house and beat her in the various video game matches. She introduced him to her friends from school, and they all hung out. She had 3 friends, Nick, Mace, and Ashley. The first time they all hung out, it was at an ice rink, and Brandon had quickly discerned that Nick liked Michaela. The boy gave him death stares anytime Michaela referred to him or hit his hand as she laughed. And Brandon was uncomfortable. He did not like being in hateful environments. He had been in one since he was a kid, and he did not like it. As they left the rink, the girls walked in front of the boys and laughed as they talked about something that amused them. Nick slowed down until he was beside Brandon. He said, "She's a nice girl, right?" Brandon played dumb. "Who?" Nick did not have time to waste. He narrowed his eyes at Brandon and said, "Don't play dumb with me, Brandon. Do you like her?" But Brandon did not want to appear weak to the boy. He had been bullied all his life, and he was not going to cower in front of a boy who had brewed animosity towards him all because of a silly crush. He faced the boy nose to nose and said, "Listen, Nick, I don't have the slightest clue what you're talking about. If you would like to clarify yourself, then go on. Otherwise, don't come at me again." If Nick had a response to that, it died in his throat the moment Mace called out to them. When they walked close to the girls, Michaela muttered something about boys being obsessed with checking their heights. If only she knew. The thing was, Brandon did not even like Michaela in that way. He was extremely thankful to have her in his life. She made him laugh, and they confided in themselves. They binge-watched Stranger Things together. She made him forget that his dad was incarcerated. She made his mom laugh, and she appreciated his coffee-making skills more than any other person. It was relieving to have someone who got him. All his life, none of his age mates wanted to associate with him. And finally, having someone who not only wanted to associate with him, but also cared about him, liked his mom, and introduced her to his friends was nice. It was all Brandon ever wanted. When the school year began, Michaela, Mace, and Nick were in their sophomore year, while Brandon was in his freshman year. They did not ice him out. They said hi to him when they met him in the hallway, and Nick remained stoic towards him. The boy was not bothered by the other one's baseless bitterness towards him. His mom had finally started receiving calls from the prison. She had finally started to talk to his dad, and even though she said that she was not ready to see him yet, she was taking a step toward being ready to forgive him. Brandon was happy. He still worked in the coffee shop, but his hours were reduced, and his schedule was fixed around the time he returned from school to closing time. He walked back home from school with Michaela every day as she talked to him about stuff that happened in her classes. Their friendship bloomed, and Brandon was happier than he had been in a while. 3 weeks into the beginning of the school year, there was a party in a kid's house. The kid, Shane, was on the school's soccer team with Nick, and they were both good pals. The party was the talk of the week, and everyone looked forward to it. Everyone except Brandon. He had never been to a party before, and he did not want to go. Michaela would not hear that. She urged, pleaded, and threatened to drag him to the party. By then, he was used to her ways, so he just laughed and still refused to go to the party. Michaela did not understand how he would want to miss the party. She said attending parties was crucial to every high school student because friendships were formed in parties, and he needed friends to get through high school. So, she talked to his mom. His mom was on her side, and together they made Brandon go to the party. 30 minutes into the party, Brandon was yet to regret it. Yes, it was exactly how he had pictured it. People were dressed in flimsy clothes, and they danced in an open space, next to sweaty strangers while they drank liquor from red party cups. The lights were the blinking ones that movies used in clubs, and people laughed loudly over the music. Even though he did not particularly like it, he was excited to finally be in a scene like that. He had gone with Michaela, who, true to her eccentric social butterfly spirit, had jumped after the first face she recognized. Truly, he was happy just being in the place and walking through the rooms to the kitchen. He was glad Michaela had made him come with her. Speaking of Michaela, as he walked outside to the backyard of the house, he saw her and 3 other people in the swimming pool. When she saw him, she waved and called out to him, "Come on, join us in here." He shook his head no and went to take a seat by the deck chair. Michaela never took no for an answer, and she continued to badger him. "Come on, Brandon, you never do anything crazy. Join us." "I am finally at this party. This is one crazy thing I have done recently." She rolled her eyes at him. "And can you say that you aren't enjoying the party?" When he shrugged, she said, "I knew it. Now join us. You'll enjoy this as well." Then she began to hail his name, and true to the high school spirit, other people around began to call his name as well. Then Brandon proved that peer pressure did exist and could affect almost everyone by taking off his clothes and jumping into the pool. The water felt nice, and they all splashed around and played in the water until they got tired. They dressed up back in their dried clothes, and when he checked the pockets of his jacket for his phone, he did not find it there. He later found the phone on the deck chair, and he assumed that the phone must have fallen out when he dropped his jacket, so he put it back in his pocket. He walked back home with Mace, Ashley, and Michaela. They talked and laughed as they walked, and the wind blew around them as though to calm them from the storm that was brewing. Brandon's house was the closest to the party location, so they planned to walk with him over there before they would book an Uber over to Michaela's, where they would spend the night. But when they got to Brandon's, there were 2 cops' cars out front, and a few policemen littered the environment. He was scared. He thought it had something to do with his dad, and he approached them. When they saw him, they asked who he was, and he introduced himself. They exchanged glances for a second, and Brandon almost shit his pants in that second. He wanted them to spit it out. And where was his mom? He knew that she was a heavy sleeper, but the cop's noise should be able to wake her up, right? Then the men gave him the most terrible news he had received since he moved to Arizona with his mom. They said she had been involved in a ghastly car accident, and that she was in the emergency unit. His body went rigid, and he was immediately unaware of his environment. His chest felt like it was on fire, and he could not seem to get any words out of his mouth. He was still in a daze when the cops drove him over to the hospital. Michaela went with him. Why? Why did she even have to drive at night? When they let him see his mom, a quick breath escaped his mouth. Her small frame was laid on the hospital bed, and several tubes were connected to her body. She looked so out of life, and all her energy and short fuse were nowhere to be found. Brandon lost it and began to yell in the hospital. He yelled at Michaela, who was the closest person to him, and cried. He was dragged out of his mom's room, and when he managed to calm down, he was informed about the details of her accident. The cops said they retrieved her phone from the scene, and the last text she had gotten was from him. They showed it to him. The phone showed that he had texted her asking that she come pick him up from the party, and he shook his head so hard. He said he hadn't texted his mom. He said he could prove it, and he went straight to her contact on his phone and clicked on their texts. Sure enough, there was a text from him saying that he was tired of the party and asking her to come pick him up. He sat down on the hospital floor in distress. Someone must have texted his mom with his phone and made her leave the house to come to pick him up from the party. They made her drive at night to come pick him up, and now she was in the hospital. The doctor said that her condition was bad and that she needed adequate care. That night, Brandon could not sleep. He cried in bed. He tossed in bed. He thought in bed. He thought long and hard. Someone must have texted his mom when he went swimming. But who would have done that? And why did he not have a passcode on his phone? Did the universe have something against his family driving cars? When morning came, he ran straight to the hospital hoping to meet good news. But the doctor said that his mom had drifted into a coma, and they were not sure when she would wake up. Brandon shut down. He blamed Michaela for making him go to the party, so he shifted away from her. He ignored Mace and Ashley and all the efforts they made to get him to open up to them. He was slowly returning to the friendless cocoon that he had been in when he arrived in Arizona. He continued to work in the coffee shop, but he was not as friendly as he was when he started working there. He was constantly mad at everything, and when Michaela continued to try to get him to talk to her, he yelled at her in the school's hallway one morning, and she ran away from him in tears. He felt bad when he saw her leave in tears, but he was glad that at least she would not bother him again. Every morning before school, he checked his mom in the hospital, and when he talked to his dad, he did not mention that she was in a coma. He spoke as firmly as he could, and even when his dad deciphered that something was off from his tone, he wouldn't tell him. A week after he yelled at Michaela in the hallway, Nick walked up to him after school. The boy was nervous as he approached Brandon. Then he said, "Hey, Brandon, there is something I need to tell you." Without turning to face him, Brandon asked, "What do you want?" Then he started talking. When he confessed that he was the one who texted his mom with his phone and that it was only because he had snatched Michaela's attention from him, Brandon hit him squarely on the nose. As he opened his mouth to talk again, Brandon let out his anger on his face again. He was dragged away by the literature teacher. It was the second time he was involved in a school fight, and both times were for legit reasons. As much as he asked, Brandon did not tell the principal the cause of the fight. He saw no need in saying anything. They would surely plead the boy's case to a misdemeanor, and he did not want to go through all that stress for nothing. So the principal gave him a week's detention. He took it the way he took everything else, tough-skinned. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and his mom was yet to come out of her state. Every day he got pissed, and whenever he caught Michaela's eyes in the hallway, he would turn away. He never came across Nick again. It was as though the other boy ran in the opposite direction whenever he saw him. And it was not for nothing. He had put his mom in the hospital for 13 months because of a silly crush. One morning, as Brandon brushed his teeth to get ready for the day, the hospital called. He immediately assumed the worst, after all. That was all his life had fed him with. The doctor's voice was light through the phone as she informed him that someone wanted to speak to him. There was shuffling in the background, and he held his breath as he heard a weak voice say, "Hey." His heart beat wildly in his chest. "Mom!" the voice said again. "Hey, Brand." In no time, he was in the hospital and ran wildly to the room where his mom had spent the last year of her life in. She smiled weakly at him when she saw him, and a tear dropped from his right eye. The doctor excused herself and left the room. Brandon ran to his mother's side. He called her over and over as though he could not believe that she was awake and smiling at him. "How have you been, Brand?" she asked. Her voice was rough and weak, but he was happy to hear it again. He smiled through his tears. "I have been bad, Mom. I've been really bad. I missed you so much." Tears clouded her vision, and she pulled him closer to her. She said, "I'm sorry," over and over until she sounded like a broken record. They met themselves in a familial hug, and she brushed down his hair as he sobbed on her shoulder. When they finally parted, she used her callous thumbs to clean his tears, and he smiled down at her until she asked, "How is Michaela doing?" History stiffened at the question, and he tried to dodge it, but she pried the whole story out of him. When he was done, she was not happy. She told him, "I know that this past year has been difficult for you, and I cannot even begin to imagine what you went through. But you don't have to push people away, especially not people like Michaela." He nodded as she spoke. She said, "Promise me you'll apologize." He said he would, and she pressed, "Promise me you would apologize today." He laughed and said he would. Then she asked about his dad. He said that his dad was great and that they had been speaking at their scheduled time. She adjusted herself on the bed and asked for water. He gave her the one that sat on her cabinet, and she sipped slowly from it. She said that as soon as she was strong enough to, she would go over to see his dad, and he hugged her again. They sat in the hospital room, and he filled her in on what had happened throughout the year. She beamed at him and sipped water from her glass to heal her parched throat. She was so glad she was reunited with her son. She could see the traces of sadness that the past year had left in his eyes, and she was determined to clean them all out. She said to him, "You have an apology to deliver. Go apologize to Michaela and tell her that I want to see her." He nodded and stood up slowly. He kissed her forehead, and as he reached for the door, she called out in her weak voice, "And tell that Nick kid I'm coming for him." Brandon shook his head in amusement. Yes, his mom was back.